Migration Policy Centre at the European University Institute in Florence. My name's Andrew Geddes. I'll be chairing today's session. I'm very happy to welcome to today's session Amanda Bisong, who's visiting MPC at the moment. Amanda's a policy officer in the Migration and Mobility team of the European Centre for Development Policy Management, which is a think tank based in Maastricht. So has a background in law and master's degrees in international law economics and international trade policy. What Amanda's going to be talking to us about today are contested mobility norms in Africa, reconciling visions, policies and practices. So as usual, Amanda will speak for around 20 minutes or so, then we'll have time for Q&A and discussion. So those online obviously are very welcome to participate in the Q&A as well, and can just do so by either putting your questions into the chat box if you prefer, or just putting your hand up and participating in the discussion. So I'm very happy now to hand over to Amanda, please.
Thank you. I'll be talking about mobility norms, contested mobility norms in Africa, and it's a study that I did together with Francisca Zanca. And it was funded by Heinrich Boll, and we launched the study earlier this year in April. We did a policy report, and now we're working on a more academic paper, and so that's what this presentation is based on. So we set out to find out what African mobility norms are. So first of all, we asked ourselves, are there African mobility norms? If they are, what are they? Would this influence how migration is understood? Would it influence how migration is practiced? And I have a quote there from an article which says, as for Africa, generally, governments have not treated migration as a priority issue because they see mobility as a natural phenomenon driven by processes of development and social transformation. Now, this is an example from an article, but it's something that you see over and over again in policy and academic discussions, that migration in Africa is viewed as being unique or is viewed from a different perspective. And it seems like there are some written or unwritten assumptions about how migration in Africa works or how it should work. And so we were wondering, are there underlying norms that play into how migration is perceived on the continent? And so this was what we wanted to find out. We spoke to several migration experts, and when we asked our interviewers what was unique about migration on the continent, they painted a very complex picture. Some people said migration is a right, migration is a normal element of life, it's a rite of passage, is essential for development. And then also we found really sophisticated policy frameworks on migration at the regional level, at the continental level, and in national policies. But then these frameworks always suffered from a lack of implementation. So our argument was that by understanding what these norms are and analyzing them, we would be able to shed some light on the complexity of migration in Africa, because trying to look into or trying to create a situation where people are more aware of the complexities of migration in Africa. And when we talk about African mobility norm, we in no way detract from the fact that Africa is a diverse continent with 54 countries. And so, of course, there would be a lot of regional specificities or national specificities on how these norms would apply. And so what we're looking for here is a common denominator. So our research started out with an exploratory approach, and we aimed to develop a bottom-up understanding of what migration norms or African mobility norms are. And we conducted 22 interviews in person and online. These were semi-structured interviews conducted between August and September. The in-person interviews were conducted in Nairobi. We spoke to African migration experts. These included academics, policy advisors, consultants working on migration, civil servants, civil society advocates, legislators, and representatives from the AU. So it was a very broad mix of stakeholders that we spoke to. And based on previous literature on African migration, we identified 8 deductive norm statements. And we tested these norm statements in our interviews. So we kind of adopted a deductive inductive approach. We used these norm statements to test with our interviewees, and we started the interviews with, what do you understand as a norm? And based on that, we also asked, do you think that this is this norm statement, to test the norm statement, do you think that this is an African mobility norm? Where would you think contestations are? Where do you think some of the tensions are? But if we look in the literature in international relations and also in international law at what norms are, we see that norms are typically defined as widely accepted rules and regulations that stipulate acceptable behavior, and they're defined by legislation, conventions, or policy documents, and largely influenced by specific organizations. So here, of course, we see one example of definition where you say a standard of appropriate behavior for actors with a given identity, and then there's a connection between norms and institutions, or here where in a more general sense, norms give the world structure, order, and stability in the international system, or here where we're looking alternatively at everyday justifications of human behavior, so looking at moral economies and how norms affect the way migration is addressed in specific settings. But we also acknowledge that norms can be informal, they can be flexible, unwritten, and they can also be shared principles that govern behavior. And another thing we didn't really see in the literature is the fact that the conventional concept of how a norm is defined in international law and international relations scholarship lacks the awareness of power relations when it comes to norms, especially speaking from an African perspective, looking at how international norms have developed over time. And some tool scholars really deal with these issues, looking at how Tueli's third world approaches to international law, looking at how international law has developed over time, and how international norms do not address some of the issues that are related, or do not incorporate the issues related to African countries and the global South when it comes to issues around norms. When we look more closely at mobility norms, or we look at migration and norms, we see that there's some research on migration norms from the EU perspective. I think it was Ross and so on that identified value norms and rule norms, looking at implementation of international norms in EU migration law. But from the African perspective, we have, to our knowledge, very few authors have addressed the issue of mobility norms in the African context. Of course, there is Betts, who wrote about international norms and refugee protection in the African context, looking at regime stretching. And we also have Hans and Kloot, who looked at norms in terms of cultures of mobility. But beyond this, we haven't really seen much relating to what African mobility norms are. So for our definition, what we understood norms, mobility norms to be, would be forms of collaboration and contestation between policy norms, so that's norms included in policies, influenced by various actors, and social norms, process-based understanding of norms that considers the wider social political context. And these two would fuse to form what we consider mobility norms. And then we try to look at this in the African context. Speaking with some of our interviewees, when we asked the question, what is a norm? An example of one of the responses we got is, a norm is not like something legally put down in a document. It's not documented, but it's something that over time has been practiced until it becomes normal. So that's kind of aligned to the social norms aspect. And of course, you have the policy norm, which is what is contained in policies. But speaking with our interviews, we also saw that, or it was also clear that norms are fluid, norms can change, norms can evolve over time and be understood differently in different settings. And one of the main arguments we had in doing this research is that mobility norms can help us understand the priority of migration policies in the African context and why some policies are implemented and why they're not. So we came up with 8 norm statements on migration in Africa. Migration is essential for development. Free movement in trade will shape economic development. The diaspora is one of the most important actors for African governments to engage with. Africa's history of Pan-Africanism paves the path for free movement. There's a culture of welcome that protects people on the move. African migrants have legal rights and these need to be respected. With the rise of security problems, African countries need to protect their borders. African states are sovereign countries and need to protect their markets and citizens. And we asked our interviewees what they thought of these norm statements and if they agreed to them as representing what they would consider African mobility norms. And then they also discussed what they considered the contestations within these norms. We further categorized these 8 norm statements into 4 normative ideas. So based on economic norms, representative symbolic norms like diaspora and Pan-Africanism, solidarity norms, and domestic protection norms. When we look, for example, at migration is essential for development, we find this norm is being practiced in the society. So when you speak with experts, they say, well, yes, indeed, there's a link between migration and development. We also find it in policies developed by the African Union or by regional organizations, also at national level. And then when you speak with policymakers, they also see the different aspects of migration and development with regards to forced migration, with regards to remittances, for example. One thing that was interesting came out from this discussion was equating, looking at migration, forced migration and the development opportunities that come from that in transforming cities or transforming areas where refugee camps, for example, are located. So the development is not only viewed in terms of providing for the refugees, but also development for the areas where these refugee camps are located, the people that are living in these areas. So for example, schools, hospitals built in these areas, develop the region for the local community that live there. And that was an interesting finding. But we also find contestations when it comes to migration and development. So for example, whose development is the development of the migrants, the development of the society. Also, it depends on the country. You look to in some countries, the development of the migrant is seen as a threat to the development of the local communities or people within these communities. And so there's a lot of contestation around there. When we look at the resonance of these norms, so when we ask, do you think this is a norm? Is this a norm for you personally? Because we asked the interviewees to identify whether or not this was a norm for them personally. We find that with migration and development, for example, or free trade, there was a high level of resonance, but with things like secure borders and sovereignty, it was way lower, while some are sort of disputed. So, for example, in terms of diaspora, or Pan-Africanism or the culture of welcome, it was a bit more disputed. For things like migrant rights, where you had like a unanimous agreement that this is important, you find statements like migrants' rights are not just migrants' rights, they are human rights. But when it comes to something like borders, you find that the explanation that, well, African countries are sovereign, they need to protect their own market, but the rhetoric is that Africa is open to business, especially with the adoption of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and the move towards having free movement on the continent. But we also found a divergence of opinions. So, for example, on migrants' rights, while there was a unanimity that this is a norm, we still found that their aspirations were different from the realities on ground. So, for example, on the protection of migrants, human rights activists noted that, unfortunately, we've been harsh to our own people. So realizing that African governments don't offer the best protection of migrants' rights on the continent. And also when it comes to borders, there may be a push to a certain direction. So one of our interviewees said, if African countries fail to adhere to the wider global political consensus that follows restrictive migration policies, at least since 9/11, including at borders, they may lose partnerships in trade, aid, and diplomacy. Since Africa is not an island, it is connected to the rest of the globe. So again, within borders, picturing that fact. And now when we look at the disjuncture between social norms and policy norms, we see that for some of these norm statements that we tested, there is no disjuncture. So for example, diaspora, there's no disjuncture between policy norms and social norms. Also, what you have in practice and what you have in the policy documents are kind of aligned. When it comes to free trade or to development, there's no disjuncture, but there are major implementation problems, especially when it comes to free trade, because while the rhetoric is that Africa is open for business, the policies and practices don't really allow for that to happen. When we look at issues relating to Pan-Africanism, for example, there's a strong disjuncture between social and policy norms, migrants' rights also, and then the culture of welcome. And this is because I will discuss this further, why some of these contestations arise. But on the question of Pan-Africanism, for example, it's not clear. What do you mean by Pan-Africanism? And how has this changed and how it has evolved over the years also plays into this disjuncture between the social and policy norms. And then when we look at secure borders, the disjuncture often arises because in terms of the social norms, it just doesn't exist. So speaking with people, looking at the issues around secure borders or national sovereignty, while the policy norms might be in place, the social norms, so the practices are really not there to feed. So that's why you have this disjuncture. We identified 3 types of contestations when it comes to the different mobility norms. The most contested norms were, and these 3 types of contestation were around social political rhetoric, conceptual contestations, and implications for policy. So social political rhetoric is migrants are a security threat, migrants could steal our job, and this is linked to migration and development. All migrants are an economic burden. This is where you found these kinds of contestations. Another common contestation at the conceptual level was around Pan-Africanism. So what does it mean? It means different things to different people. We spoke to 22 interviewees, and all 22 of them had a different take on what Pan-Africanism meant or what it should mean, which parts of it aligned with what is contained in AU policy documents, but parts stepped out or extended beyond that. For some people, it ranged from a political call to action. For some other people, it revolved around Afrobeats, dance, fashion, design. That was what they considered Pan-Africanism. Also, what is a secure border? And how would this relate with free movement? I think this were also conceptual issues that came up. And then other forms of contestation were it regards to implications for policies. So the fact that there's a lack of political consensus in implementing some policies at the regional or at the national level, and again, the undue external influence as it relates to developing or certain policies on the continent. Yeah. So when we looked at the implementation of mobility policies, we saw that across the board, there's a huge issue with regards to implementation. And reasons for this included insufficient budgets, capacity issues, competing interests at the national, regional, or the continental level, or even at the national level, competing domestic interests were responsible for the lack of implementation of some of these measures. And we also saw that, well, Western influence was one of the issues, because we looked also into the ways some of these policies were developed, and you had interviewees telling you, well, there's a huge disjuncture between the social norms and the policy norms, because most of these policy norms do not reflect the social norms because of the way the policies are developed. And here we have a nice quote saying, whatever change that will come from coercion will not last. And so this is referring to policy norms or policies that are drafted based on Western influence. Interviewees also noted that the donor interest and the focus on migration outside of the continent made it difficult to implement certain norms. So while for them the focus would be on intra-African migration, but then most of the policies that are crafted are usually focused on migration out of the continent. And we really found, what we found at the end of the day was that there are pluralistic pluralistic mobility norms. So again, alluding to the fact around policies, that the disjuncture between policy norms and social norms, we find that the policies are a performance rather than a carefully thought out thing. This was from one of the interviewees. And this is in contrast to social norms, where we find that it's a system that remains unchanged on the ground and people know what to expect, and often it's not written. So then you see the reason for the disjuncture between the policy norms and the social norms. But one of the things that came out of this research, and one of the things that was raised when we talk about mobility norms, is the importance of these norms for everyday mobility, the need to acknowledge the diversity of norms, and especially when social and policy norms are divergent, what should be done in that context in terms of aligning or bringing them together. And my last slide. In conclusion, we set out to ask the question, are the African mobility norms? And the answer is yes, but one of our main arguments was that these norms, identifying these mobility norms, would help us understand the priorities of migration policies. We found the disjunction between social and policy norms. So what happens in everyday practice versus what is contained in legal text. We found that mobility norms are often a mismatch between social norms and policy norms. We found that these norms are fluid, they can change and evolve and have different, they can be understood differently in different settings. But what we argue for is the fact that there's still more space needed for a plurality of expressions and the acknowledgement of social norms in an evolving social political context. So that would look towards linking more social norms with policy norms, so these everyday practices and how they can be translated into the policies and into legal text at the end of the day. And also the fact that, but we acknowledge that policy adoption processes were criticized as being disconnected from the realities of the society and being driven by the interests of political elites and donors. So this is something that would need to be addressed. And we found that it's necessary to continue identifying and testing norm statements and creating knowledge on African mobility norms. So these 8 norms were identified, are in no way conclusive. There were several other, 3 other norms were identified that we couldn't, we didn't include in the research, but yes, so there's need to continue identifying and testing norm statements. Thank you.
Thank you, man. So we can now open the floor for discussion. Also, people online, if you've got questions, please indicate. And so who'd like to open the discussion? Please, Clara. Do you want to introduce yourself as well? So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Laura Peitz. I'm also a visitor right now at the MPC. I'm based at the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees in Germany, and more concretely in their research department, doing research on well, irregular migration from Africa mostly at the time, at this moment, and well, basically, yeah, how their trajectories evolve within Germany. Thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I found it very interesting. I have, I think, 2 main points that I would like to address. The first one is on when norms diverge, or as you said, they are in this juncture. I did my PhD on a different topic, but I adopted an institutional logics approach. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it reminded me a lot of it, because it also says that sometimes logics, which might be in a way related to norms, can diverge, they might compete. And then I would be really interested in hearing more about if you have any insights into which norm prevails, you know, when they are in this juncture or competing, then which norm prevails when and where, in which context. How would stakeholders cope with this disjuncture, and whether you observed any changes over time in which norm prevails. You know, maybe at some point the human rights norm is stronger or prevails, and then it kind of shifts, and maybe a security perspective prevails. So that's the first point. And then my second point was, I'm not sure if I'm entirely convinced with the differentiating policy and social norms. I was thinking, aren't all norms in a way social, and then policies, concrete policies, kind of come out of different social norms that again prevail in a competitive environment. So I don't know, maybe just food for thought, or maybe you're nodding, so you probably have thought about it. Maybe it's more that certain policies, not policy norms, but policies kind of compete with certain social norms. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I have a question about method. I mean, this kind of work, I think, is very hard to do, because how do you know when you interview individuals, how do you elicit the norm? I mean, how do you get to the normative thinking in a way? So my question simply is, can you explain again the difference between what you call a social norm and a mobility norm? Because I wasn't quite clear about that. But what you put up on the screen, you said those were mobility norm statements, if I could remember, but there were a mix of different types of things, right? Which to me, some of which to me sounded like, you know, what's your normative preference for migration policy? So I suppose my question is, by having spoken to your 22 people, some of whom are in civil society, now, how do you know that that reflects what you call a social norm or mobility norm? I mean, wouldn't that, speaking provocatively, wouldn't that just reflect their personal normative preferences about what policy should be? But in what way does that reflect actually the kind of wider prevailing thinking around this? Thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much for the questions. So starting with which norms prevail, where and in which context, and then the changes over time. So something that came out of the interviews was the fact that norms do change over time, and an example of this was also, we clearly saw this when we looked at cultures of migration. So the fact that there is a culture of migration on the continent, and what it means and how it has changed over time, given security issues, given issues around border control. And so that we were able to see. In terms of which norm prevails, when and where, we found that regardless of what you had in the policies, somehow social norms always manage to still, they're still being practiced every day, right? Because this is what's happening on the ground. And so you found that these practices continue regardless of what is contained in the policy. And indeed, in differentiating between policy norms and social norms, we struggled. And we're still struggling right now as we're writing the paper. So any ideas you have will be very welcome. But the idea was there are some norms that are contained in the legal documents, or that are written. So not necessarily all of them are legal documents, but they are written, right? So they are written norms, and then there are norms that are practiced every day at the border by people, by migrants. And so how would we differentiate between these norms that are practiced every day and the norms that are written and contained in several policy documents? So we looked to some research. There was research on practicality of norms, and they had this disjuncture between, or this differentiation between policy norms and social norms, and say, okay, policy norms is what's contained in the documents, and social norms is what is actually practiced every day by people. And this was, I think, research done in the South African context, where they were trying to explain the reasons why you had certain things written down in policies, but then in actual practice by state actors also, and by people, by individuals every day, you found the practice was completely different from what was happening in the written policies or in the written documents. And so that was where they adopted this sort of distinction between policy norms and social norms. And so we said, well, this kind of speaks to what we're doing here, and so we adopted it, but we're still struggling a bit with it. So any insights you have would be really welcome. Thank you very much, Martin, for the question about methods. Again, yeah, something that we're struggling with. So these norm statements, we looked through policy documents, literature, some of the work we've done, some of the work other people have done on African migration, and we identified some common statements that we found around migration and mobility on the continent. So, for example, about development, about the culture, about security, about borders, and I do acknowledge that it's different things, but then the commonality, I guess, was the fact that they were all talking about African migration, or perspectives of African migration. And so we decided to test them to say, okay, do you think this is a norm? And again, we asked the interviewers to respond personally. So indeed, it might just be personal reflections of what they think about these norm statements. But the idea was that by getting people who are involved in migration daily from different perspectives, they would share some insights on whether or not they consider these issues to be contributing towards an African mobility norm. It's a bit of an exploratory research, which is why we started this way. And the hope is to try to fine-tune the work. Yeah, but again, if you have any suggestions, happy to take them on, because the idea would be to try to strengthen these norm statements and at least make them a bit more similar. Yeah.
Thanks. Can you switch the microphone off? Thanks. So we've got two in the room. Just quickly, a question online as well before we go to Carlotta. So Vincenzo Pono has asked how this research intersects with the perception of mobility, especially in the context of ECOWAS mobility with ECOWAS, the ECOWAS passport. So that's a question from Vincenzo, and then over to Carlotta.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I really enjoyed the presentation. I guess you did clarify some of the points that I was thinking about in your previous answers, but I'll push a little bit more on that because I come from an IR background working on norms. So I guess my first question or comment is what kind of goal you have for this article? Do you want it to be a theory contribution where you focus on Africa as a case study, or is it more just focusing on the case study per se and trying to sort of bring in some conceptual understandings of what is going on? Because what I was sort of not unconvinced, but puzzled a little bit by the distinction between social norms, mobility norms, and policy norms. But what I was thinking in a sense is that when you think about norm literature, you have Acharya's localization framework, the circulation framework. You do have, the meaning in practice sort of idea of defining norms, not standards of appropriate behavior, but basically just practices that are continually negotiated, contested, and recontested. But what is interesting in your case is that, in a sense, what you're saying is that we track norm diffusion, looking at the documents that say African Union, the international organizations, or even other sort of international organization above the continent, try to sort of push on Africa, and those are embedded in the policies or institutionalized. But at the ground value of practice, when you go to the actual people that live with migrations or practice migration, there's something else happening. And I think this is a very interesting finding that it's worth thinking about more, because what you're saying in a sense is that yes, there is institutionalization, but that doesn't translate. That doesn't translate into the actual life of the norm. Now, how to think about that conceptually? I'm thinking about. Well, of course, you will look at decolonial because you use the word power and you said power hasn't really been brought in. But there are some newer contributions that look at not just practice theory, but for example, genealogies of norms and tensions within norms, and how this basically allow certain norms to be institutionalized and center others, in a sense, to be lost in the institutionalization process, which is very Western centric, but at the same time to live in the everyday life of certain different communities. And this is it can be actually powerful if those are actually then the norms that are practiced and enacted, whereas the other ones are pushed to the side because maybe they're not implemented for budgetary reason, but maybe they're not implemented because they don't reflect the local situation. So I think that there you have a very interesting empirical story, and you also have a very powerful, perhaps theoretical story that you can push on the norm side. And then I was, from the methodological perspective, echoing what Martin was saying, why did you pick Kenya? Because you're talking about African mobility norms, and obviously you said yourself, okay, there's 54 countries. We pick Kenya, and we interview 22 people. I mean, this would probably be a much bigger, research project, but there's some people studying norms. I'm thinking Stimmer, Dale, Valentino, that are running some surveys with not elites, but mostly individuals to try to understand when is a norm. Because as you said, it doesn't have to be written, but sometimes it is written. And so I'm not saying how many people you need, more than 22 to define that a norm is a norm, but this could be, I mean, as a norm person in IR, I find this very, very interesting because there is the potential to actually, make a very interesting empirical and powerful also theoretical contribution here. So I was just thinking maybe if you have plans to expand the cases, not just to Kenya, because maybe, Kenya, yes, it's an interesting case, but having maybe representative cases across the continent so that you can say you have a sample that's representative of Africa, and then you can use discourse analysis or create a dictionary maybe to come up in a more systematized way, with a way to identify these norms.
Oh, I can stretch. Amanda, thanks a lot. Great paper, report, and presentation. I love the fact that you have very precise norm statements that really forces people to think. A bit like Martin and Carlotta. My question, as I do strange movements here, is an exhibitionist. That's why I was okay. yeah, I was not maybe fully convinced of what the 22 people you interviewed stand for. I understand that you use those interviews as try and understand social norms. Perhaps if you want to develop this publication further, as a reader, I would appreciate more information on how you select them and how representative they can really be, also because they cover a fairly large spectrum of people, civil society, academia, I understand, and so on. You do something that I find extremely interesting. So there is some research now on how policymakers and politicians understand the public and what they think the public wants. And you do the other way around. You ask these people how they understand policymakers, and you even, if I understand correctly, you force them to come up with percentages. So how many policymakers you think would agree that, you know, it's important to secure the borders. And by doing that, I think that's a very important part of what you do. You show which of those norms or statements are more politicized. So development, for example, and diaspora maybe are not so much, but there are others, again, borders, where the people you interviewed seems to suggest there might be very strong differences between how they think and what policymakers want, which is maybe something you can tease out a little bit more. Now, the question for you is, when you ask your interviewees what they think policymakers think, what policymakers do you think they have in mind? And sorry, this is an extremely long sentence, but I imagine they might be thinking about national policymakers, but of course there are, you know, a lot other institutions in the African context that produce written norms. So I wonder whether they always think about national politicians, or maybe, you know, the norms produced by the African Union, for example, or by some of the other free movement areas. And then the other question is whether, maybe linking to something that Carlotta was saying, I understand you spoke maybe only or mainly with people who are based in Kenya. How much that would vary if you were to take different regions and places in the African continent? Of course, there might be very important differences between Kenya and South Africa or Tunisia, and whether what you find can really be representative of the whole continent, or maybe more specific to one region of it. I hope some of that makes sense. Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Jose. So we'll take, there's quite a lot there in those three questions. So we've Vincenzo, Carlotta, and Lorenzo. So then we'll come back for another round afterwards. So I think you've got plenty to address there as well.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. With regards to how this research intersects with the perception of mobility, especially in the context of ECOWAS mobility with the ECOWAS passport, I guess one of the things that it showed us, especially when we look at free movement in trade, was the fact that regional economic communities play a key role in pushing the free movement and trade agenda. And so ECOWAS, which is one of these regional economic communities, and is quite strong in terms of promoting free movement of persons and free movement of goods, was a good example of this. So there we had a norm statement testing free movement of trade, a free movement in trade as being linked to the African agenda, and this was a clear example. Thank you very much, Carlotta, for your insights. I will send you an email for more details. In terms of what we think about the paper, I think we're trying to get it there where it kind of contributes a bit to the theory. And why I say this is because what we found was also quite interesting when we found that at the end of the day, social norms manage to bubble up, right? Regardless of what happens at the level of the policies, regardless of what is tried, what people try to implement at the end of the day, social norms kind of bubble up, and you really don't they don't stay down. And in the African context, we also found that there is this huge disjuncture between what happens, what's contained in the policies. The idea would be that these social norms would translate into policies, right, that would be adopted. But then we find this real huge disjuncture in the African context. And so it was something that we found, okay, really quite interesting, and we really want to build on this aspect of the paper. So I will definitely be coming back to you with an email. Regarding the methods, again, it's something that we would really have to think through. We didn't pick Kenya, so we had some interviews, some in-person interviews in Nairobi, but then the online interviews were conducted with African experts all around the continent. So we had people from West Africa, from Southern Africa, none from Central Africa, but from North Africa also. So it was kind of varied. Again, whether or not talking to 22 people would mean, well, these are the African mobility norms, I think I really doubt that, but at least it gives us room to start exploring, which is what we hoped to do with this paper, right? To explore, okay, what is there in the space? We didn't find anything. What can we say about this, and how do we dig deeper and dig further? And I think it's something that we really want to build on. Lorenzo, I see that you read the paper because in the presentation, I nicely left out the part where we talked about asking the interviewees what other policymakers would think about certain norm statements. And that's because methodologically, I think it's a bit so it's a good thing. But yeah, indeed, the interviewees we selected were quite representative, like I said. Most of the online ones, we spoke with policymakers and also practitioners in different parts of the continent. So that, and then we also spoke with some people in diaspora. In terms of how they understand the policymakers and which policymakers we think that they would have in mind. We didn't really ask that question specifically, but if you are looking at our transcript, it was clear that they were thinking about national policymakers. They weren't really thinking about the regional or the continental AU level. So from the transcripts, it was clear that they were thinking about the national level. I mean, it would be interesting. Now you say it's interesting to tease out a bit more the policymakers, how people understand policymakers. I guess there is hope for that part of the paper, because we're thinking of keeping it buried a bit, but now maybe we look at it a bit more and try to reassess how we can use that data. Obviously, we have to think through the methodology again. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. I'm Aziz Rahman, from visitor from Canada. Excellencies in Immigration and Integration. Although it's not my focus, mine is more on integration of migrants, particularly refugees in the Western world. I'm curious actually about the differences between the African mobility norms and Asian, because these are the two epicenters. So you mentioned the culture of migrations, how it is different from Asia. If you have explored through the literature, I'm just like curious how this culture develops and created, and yeah, and definitely methodologically maybe you are including all types of migrant types, including students, post migrants, and Thank you. Could I just put some question as well, Amanda, because I'm not a norm person, so it's a lot of this is quite new to me. But I suppose it's it seems to me that one of the things that will be relevant is the capacity of norms to kind of serve as a basis for mobilization. There may be particular actors who mobilize around particular norms. So I suppose it then depends on the purpose of your paper, if you're theory building or whether you're also interested in how, in the kind of dimensions of contestation, which then, because I was thinking after the question raised by Vincenzo, you can see different patterns in different regions within Africa and some tensions within regions, perhaps around security and mobility in Eastern Horn of Africa. So it was the extent to which the norms that you're interested in are mobilized and whether particular actors, in a sense, maybe become norm entrepreneurs. They become actors who mobilize around particular norms. Because at the moment it seems we have a lot of norms floating around, but obviously it's also the case that some become more meaningful in particular contexts, particular points in time. And I was wondering whether that might be something you have some thoughts on, or could be something that develops within this project. Thank you. Do we have? Obviously, if people online want to join a discussion, please feel free as well. But maybe Amanda, take those two questions to begin with.
Yep. Okay. Regarding African mobility norms and looking at mobility norms from Asia, no, I'm sorry, we didn't look in that direction, but it's probably something that yeah, maybe we can consider. If I don't know, depending on how it proceeds, if we're looking at expanding beyond looking at the African context. In terms of capacity of norms to serve as a basis for action and for mobilizing action, I think what we could see there is when it comes to migrants' rights. So yes, it's aspirational, but there is also now a lot of action, or lots of civil society actors and stakeholders are trying to create some action around migrants' rights, right? So this is something that we could indeed look into, or also free movement and trade, which, because of the AfCFTA, the African African Continental Free Trade area, and the buzz around trade and movement of persons, the involvement of private sector actors and several other people on the continent in this area, there is now a lot of awareness and a lot of movement and a lot of shifting around free movement of persons. So you're seeing changes also to visa regimes that were previously restrictive. You're seeing changes there. So again, this is something that we could also look into in the future. But indeed, examples do exist of people mobilizing around certain norms to try to push for their implementation. Also trying to push some policy norms, some social norms or some practices observed to the policy level. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Just one quick follow-up question, which just came to my mind. I understood you correctly that you basically looked at all types of mobility and migration, right? Would you expect a difference with regard to which norms exist or which norms are acted upon, with regard to whether it's intra-African mobility or whether it's mobility migration to, I don't know, Europe or transatlantic? Would you expect any differences in which norms would play a role?
So because the bulk of migration within the continent is, migration is within the continent, I think the responses we would get would mainly focus on intra-African migration and not really on migration outside of that.
Thank you. So do we have any final questions? Anybody online would like to join the discussion? I think we've had quite a lot of questions, so probably we've had quite a very good discussion. So if not, I'll bring the discussion to a close. I'd like to thank Amanda. It's very nice to see this work in progress, and hopefully the discussions been useful for it, and we may hear again in the future about how this research develops, which would be very welcome. You join me in thanking Amanda for and also those online, thank you for joining us. We'll have one final seminar on the 26th of June on the topic of trajectories of irregular migrants in Germany. That will be on Tuesday, January the 26th. It'll be our final webinar of this academic year, and you'll be very welcome to join us then as well. So thank you very much and have a nice day.